The metal was still screaming when Callum Ashworth reached the overturned car, and the first thing he saw through the shattered window was a woman's hand, limp against the broken glass, a thin gold bracelet catching the afternoon sun as if nothing in the world had just gone wrong. He would remember that bracelet for the rest of his life, the way it glinted while blood ran down her temple, the way her fingers twitched once when he touched them, the way a stranger's grip can somehow feel like a promise neither person meant to make. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet miracles of second chances, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one live and breathe because of viewers like you, because our community keeps showing up for each other, and I promise this story is going to need every bit of that goodwill by the time it's over. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October, the kind of crisp, golden day that made the whole town of Millbrook Falls look like it belonged on a postcard, when the accident happened on Route 9 just past the old grain silo. Callum had been driving back from a job site, his truck bed loaded with lumber for a porch he was building for the Hendersons, when he saw the sedan clip a guardrail, spin twice, and flip onto its roof in the gravel shoulder. He didn't remember deciding to stop. He remembered his hands on the wheel jerking the truck onto the shoulder, his boots hitting the ground before the engine had even finished ticking, and the strange, terrible silence that followed a crash before the world remembers to make noise again. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from years of carpentry work, with sawdust perpetually ground into the creases of his palms and a quiet, watchful way about him that made people either trust him instantly or find him unreadable. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of town that he'd built himself, board by board, in the 2 years since his fiancée, Marisol, had died in a hiking accident on a trail he had begged her not to take alone. He had not said her name out loud in 8 months. He carried her memory the way some men carry old scars, invisible under a sleeve, aching only when the weather changed. When he reached the overturned car, he dropped to his knees in the gravel and looked through the broken window at the woman hanging upside down in her seatbelt, blood trickling from a gash above her eyebrow, her chestnut hair falling in a curtain toward the roof of the car that was now, impossibly, beneath her. He said the only thing that came to him, over and over, in a voice that surprised him with its steadiness, "I've got you. I'm right here. I've got you." He did not know her name. He did not know if she could hear him. But he reached through the shattered glass, careful of the edges, and took her hand, and held it as though letting go might undo something more important than physics. Other cars had stopped by then, a trucker calling emergency services, a woman in a minivan holding her own children back from the wreck with trembling arms, but it was Callum who stayed pressed against that broken window, murmuring to a stranger, refusing to move even when the smell of gasoline made his stomach turn. When the paramedics finally arrived, cutting the door away with practiced efficiency, he did not let go of her hand until they physically eased his fingers from hers, and even then he stood so close that one of the paramedics, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Renata Voss with silver hoops in her ears and blood already on the knees of her uniform, turned to him and said the words that would rewrite the next several weeks of his life without either of them understanding it yet. "Thank God you're her fiancé," Renata said, not as a question but as a fact, the kind of thing said quickly in the chaos of triage, meant to comfort, meant to move things along. "She's lucky you were behind her. Ride with us, we'll need someone who knows her medical history." Callum opened his mouth to correct her. He felt the truth sitting right there on his tongue, simple and small. "I don't know her. I was just driving by. I don't even know her name." But then he looked down at the woman on the stretcher, her face pale as chalk, her lips moving faintly around words he couldn't catch, and something in him went very quiet and very still, the way it had the day he found out about Marisol, the way a person goes quiet right before they understand that a moment is about to change the shape of their life. He thought of every person who might come to a hospital for this woman, and he thought, with a kind of shame he didn't examine too closely, that if no one else showed up, at least she would not wake up entirely alone. So he said nothing. He simply nodded, and climbed into the ambulance, and did not correct her. The ride to Millbrook Falls General Hospital took 11 minutes, though Callum would later say it felt like 11 years. He sat pressed against the wall of the ambulance, watching Renata and her partner work with brisk, practiced hands, listening to numbers and words he didn't understand, pressure dropping, possible internal, get me a line, and watching the woman's face for any sign that she was still in there, still fighting. Somewhere between the flashing lights and the hiss of the oxygen mask, he learned her name from the insurance card in her purse, which the paramedics had gathered along with her other belongings, Josephine Hartley. Josie, he thought, the way you shorten a stranger's name in your head to make her feel less like a stranger, and more like someone you have some right to worry about. At the hospital, the ruse deepened before he had any real chance to stop it. A nurse at intake, brisk and kind, handed him a clipboard and asked him to fill out what he could of Josie's information, and explained, almost apologetically, that because Josie's injuries included a head trauma and possible internal bleeding, and because she had arrived unconscious, hospital policy meant only immediate family could remain with her during the initial stabilization and the surgery that would likely follow. "You're her fiancé, though, so you're fine," the nurse said, glancing at the paramedic's note already on the chart, and Callum felt the lie settle into the record like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he could not yet see the edges of. He sat in a stiff plastic chair in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee, filling out a form for a woman whose middle name he did not know, whose birthday he had to leave blank, whose emergency contact line he stared at for a long, long time before writing his own name and number, because there was no one else, because when the nurse had asked if Josie had any family to call, he had realized with a hollow feeling that he did not know how to answer that question either. He gave the form back with more blanks than answers and told the nurse, honestly for once, I don't know all of it. We haven't been together long. It was, in its strange way, the truest thing he'd said all day. The surgery took 4 hours. Callum spent them in the waiting room, drinking bad coffee he didn't taste, watching the clock hands move with the particular cruelty of hospital time, and thinking, unwillingly, of the last time he'd sat in a room like this one, waiting for news about someone he loved, and how that time the doors had opened and a doctor's face had told him everything before a single word was spoken. He found himself praying, clumsily, to whatever might be listening, not for himself, but for a woman he'd known for less than half a day, and he was ashamed of how much he meant it. When the surgeon finally came out, weary but not grim, and said that Josephine Hartley had survived surgery to repair a ruptured spleen and stabilize a fractured pelvis, that she was in critical but stable condition, that the next 48 hours would tell them more about the extent of the head injury, Callum felt his knees nearly give out with relief, an intensity of relief that startled him, because by any reasonable measure, he had no right to feel it that deeply. The surgeon clapped him on the shoulder, called him a lucky man to have gotten to her so fast, and told him he could sit with her once she was moved to recovery. Callum thanked him, and did not correct him either. It was near midnight, the one necessary sliver of darkness this story must pass through, when Callum was finally allowed into the small recovery room where Josie lay surrounded by monitors that beeped in patient, steady rhythm. He had fully intended, by then, to leave, to slip out quietly once he saw with his own eyes that she was breathing, to let the truth sort itself out with the hospital staff in the morning, to go home to his empty house and forget he had ever pretended to be someone's fiancé for an afternoon. But when he stood at the foot of her bed and looked at her bruised, sleeping face, at the tube taped along her cheek, at the 2 thin lines of stitches above her eyebrow, something in him refused to walk away. He told himself it was only that no decent person leaves someone so alone in the dark. He pulled a chair beside her bed, and sat, and did not go home that night. He was there when the sun rose the next morning, casting a soft gold light across the room, and it was that same daylight, warm and undramatic, that would color nearly every scene of what followed, because Callum found, in the days ahead, that hospitals in daylight have a different character altogether than hospitals at night, a quieter kind of hope, carts rattling down hallways, the smell of breakfast trays, families arriving with flowers and impatient children, the whole machinery of healing. Moving forward one ordinary hour at a time. He went home only to shower and change, and each time he returned, faster than he meant to, drawn back by something he did not yet have language for. On the 3rd day, a woman burst into the room with the force of a small storm, dark curls flying, mascara smudged from crying in her car, and demanded to know why no one had called her sooner. This was Dahlia Reyes, Josie's best friend since college, a florist who ran a shop 2 streets over from the hospital and who had heard about the accident secondhand from a mutual friend, and who looked at Callum sitting in the chair by Josie's bed with an expression of pure, suspicious bewilderment. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, in the tone of a woman who had personally vetted every man Josie had ever dated and did not recognize this one at all. Callum stood, and for a moment the whole fragile architecture of the lie threatened to collapse in front of him. He could have told Dahlia the truth right there. "I'm no one, I was just driving by," the medic assumed, and I never corrected her, and perhaps that would have been the wiser, cleaner choice. But he looked at Dahlia's raw, frightened face, at the way her eyes kept flicking helplessly to Josie's still form on the bed, and he understood, with sudden clarity, that the truth right now would only be one more blow landing on someone already staggering. So he said, carefully, choosing each word like a man walking across thin ice, "I'm Callum. I was behind her when it happened. I've been staying so she wouldn't be alone." It was not quite a lie and not quite the truth, and Dahlia, exhausted and frightened, took it exactly as he'd hoped, as reassurance, not as a confession requiring further explanation. Over the following days, Dahlia became something like an ally in the strange half-truth Callum had built. She never explicitly called him Josie's fiancé, and Callum never explicitly claimed the title again, but the hospital records did the talking for him, and Dahlia, grateful simply to have someone else standing watch, did not question it too hard. She brought him coffee. She told him stories about Josie, how Josie had been the one to hold Dahlia's hand through her own mother's funeral, how Josie taught second grade at Millbrook Falls Elementary and kept a drawer full of granola bars for kids who came to school hungry, how Josie painted watercolors of the lake at dawn and had, just that year, finally worked up the courage to hang 3 of them in the community art show. Each detail Dahlia shared felt to Callum like a small gift, a brick laid in the foundation of a person he was beginning, against all reason, to care about deeply. It was Dahlia who first mentioned Josie's father, and it was the way she said his name, flat, careful, the way you speak about something you've learned to step around, that told Callum there was a wound there long before anyone explained it to him. Walter Hartley. Josie's father, who lived 40 minutes away in the next county, who had not spoken to his daughter in nearly 3 years, not since an argument the details of which Dahlia clearly did not feel it was her place to share. "He should know she's here," Dahlia said, staring at her coffee cup rather than at Callum, "but I don't have the first idea how to reach him, and honestly, I'm not sure Josie would want me to." Callum did not ask further that day, but the thought lodged in him and would not leave. He found himself, in the quiet hours of the afternoon while Josie slept, reading the entries she'd left behind in a small leather journal that had been among her things, not out of any wish to violate her privacy, he told himself, but out of a growing need to understand the person whose hand he had refused to let go of on the side of Route 9. Later, he would tell her the truth about this too, and she would not be angry, because by then she would understand exactly why he'd needed to know her. The journal was not a diary of secrets so much as a scattering of half-finished letters, most of them addressed to her father and never sent. In one, dated the previous spring, she had written about the day her mother died, 6 years earlier, and how her father had disappeared into his grief so completely that he had, in Josie's words, left twice, once when Mom died, and again when he stopped being able to look at me, because I have her eyes, and I think that broke something in him he never let himself fix. In another entry, more recent, she had written about the fight that finally ended their relationship, an argument over selling the family lake house, the one place Josie had left that still smelled like her mother's perfume in the closets, and how her father had said, in the heat of it, that keeping the house was just Josie's way of refusing to let either of them move on. She had written, simply, "I don't think he meant it. I think he just doesn't know how to say sorry, so he says cruel things instead and calls it honesty." Reading it, Callum thought of his own long silence about Marisol, the way grief could curdle into something that looked like anger but was really just love with nowhere left to go, and he understood Walter Hartley a little, even before he ever met the man. On the 6th day, Josie began to surface. It happened slowly, in flickers, her fingers twitching against the blanket, her eyelids fluttering during the long afternoons when Callum read to her from whatever book he'd found in the hospital gift shop, simply because a nurse had once mentioned that patients in prolonged unconscious states sometimes responded to the sound of a familiar voice, and by then, absurdly, impossibly, his had become the voice she heard most. On the seventh day, her eyes opened fully, unfocused at first, then sharpening on the ceiling, then, slowly, on him. She did not speak right away. The doctors had warned him that when she did wake, she might be confused, that head injuries could scramble memory and time in strange ways, that he should be patient and let her find her own bearings. So when her gaze finally settled on his face and her lips moved to form a single word, a name, Callum's whole chest seized with dread, because the word she said was not his. "Adam," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, and Callum felt something in him go cold, because he did not know who Adam was, and for one terrible second he thought the whole fragile structure he'd built was about to collapse into a stranger's name. But then her eyes cleared further, focused harder, and she blinked at him with obvious confusion, and said, more clearly this time, "You're not Adam." It was, he would later understand, the name of an old boyfriend, someone from years before, dredged up by a concussed mind still sorting fact from memory. Callum, humbled and relieved in equal measure, said gently, "No. I'm not. My name's Callum." And Josie, exhausted, her eyes already sliding shut again, murmured, "Okay." Callum, as though that settled something, as though a stranger's name was enough to be going on with, and drifted back to sleep holding his hand, which he had, without quite realizing it, taken again. The confession Callum dreaded came 2 days later, when Josie was lucid enough to hold a real conversation, when the nurses had removed most of the tubes and she was propped up against pillows, pale but alert, picking at a hospital lunch tray with the particular disdain of someone finally well enough to complain about the food. A young nurse breezed in to check her vitals and said, cheerfully, "Your fiancé here has barely left your side all week, you're a lucky woman," and Josie's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth, and her eyes moved slowly, carefully, to Callum's face, and Callum understood that the moment he had been both dreading and, in some secret corner of himself, delaying, had finally arrived. When the nurse left, the room went very quiet. Josie set down her spoon. "Fiancé," she repeated, testing the word like it might be a joke she hadn't caught the punchline to yet. "I don't have a fiancé." She studied him, not with anger yet, but with the sharp, assessing look of a woman doing arithmetic that wasn't adding up. "I don't actually know you at all, do I?" Callum had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his head over the preceding week, in the shower, in his truck, in the long silent hours of the waiting room, and every version he'd rehearsed had sounded more confident than the halting, honest thing that actually came out of him now. He told her everything, the accident, the way he'd reached her car first, the way Renata had said those words in the chaos and he simply hadn't found it in himself to correct her, the way one silence had led to another until the lie had built itself a house he hadn't meant to move into. He told her about filling out her intake form with more blanks than answers. He told her, his voice rough with something like shame, that he'd read parts of her journal, trying to understand who she was so he could be of some use to the people who loved her, and that he was sorry for that most of all. "I should have told the truth on day one," he said. "I don't have a good excuse. I didn't want you to wake up and find out you were alone." He braced himself for her fury. He thought, reasonably, that a woman waking from a coma to discover a stranger had been impersonating her fiancé for a week, reading her private journal, deciding on her behalf what she needed, had every right to be furious, to call security, to never want to see him again. Instead, Josie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the thin hospital blanket over her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. "I don't have anyone who would have come," she said. "That's the truth of it. If you hadn't stayed, it would have just been Dahlia, running herself ragged between the shop and here, and eventually the shop would have needed her more, and I would have woken up completely alone in a hospital, and honestly, Callum, I think some sad, stubborn part of me has been waiting for that to happen for years." She looked up at him, her eyes bright and unsteady. "So no. I'm not angry that you stayed. I'm angry that a stranger had more reason to show up for me than my own father did. That admission cracked something open in the room, and in the two of them, and it was there, in the daylight of an ordinary hospital afternoon with lunch trays clattering somewhere down the hall, that the real story began, not the lie Renata Voss had accidentally started on the side of Route 9, but the true, slower, harder story of two grieving people learning to let each other in. Over the following weeks, as Josie moved from the hospital to a rehabilitation unit and slowly regained the strength in her pelvis and the confidence in her steps, Callum kept coming back, not as a fiancé now, not under any pretense at all, but simply as himself, a carpenter with sawdust in his palms and a quiet, careful way of showing up. He brought her the watercolor paints Dahlia said she missed most, propped against a hospital tray so she could paint from her window even before she could walk to it. He fixed the wobbly leg on a bedside table without being asked, because that was the only language of care he'd ever fully trusted, hands doing what his heart hadn't yet learned to say. He told her, in pieces, over many afternoons, about Marisol, about the trail, about the 2 years of silence that had followed, about how he had built his house alone because it was easier to hammer boards than to sit with grief that had nowhere useful to go. Josie listened the way he had listened to her, without trying to fix it, only holding space for it, and somewhere in that mutual holding, something neither of them had expected began, quietly, to grow. It was Josie, in fact, who eventually raised the subject of her father, on a gray afternoon in the rehabilitation unit when the accident's aftershocks had made her, for the first time in years, genuinely afraid of her own mortality, afraid enough to admit that fear out loud. "I keep thinking," she said, watching rain streak the window, though the story, true to its nature, would return to daylight before the hour was out, what if I hadn't woken up? What if the last thing between me and my father was a fight about a house? I don't want that to be the ending, Callum. I don't know how to fix it, but I don't want that to be the ending. Callum did not offer easy solutions. He had learned enough about grief by then to know it does not respond well to easy solutions. But he offered to drive her, when she was strong enough, the 40 minutes to Walter Hartley's house, and to wait outside if she wanted him to, or to come in if she wanted that instead, and simply to be there either way, the same quiet, steady presence he had been since the moment he'd refused to let go of her hand on the roadside. The drive, 3 weeks later, was mostly silent, Josie's hands twisting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing fields gone gold and brittle with the last of autumn. When they pulled into the gravel driveway of a small, tired-looking house with an overgrown garden and a porch light that had clearly not been changed in years, Josie sat frozen for a long moment before Callum reached over, without a word, and took her hand, the same gesture from the roadside, offered now not out of instinct in a crisis but out of something steadier, something chosen. Walter Hartley opened the door before they'd even reached the porch steps, alerted by the sound of tires on gravel, and the sight of his daughter, thinner than he remembered, a faint scar still visible above her eyebrow, undid something in his face that he had clearly spent years holding rigidly in place. He did not say much at first. He was not, Callum would learn, a man of many words even in the best of times. But he stepped forward and pulled his daughter into an embrace so sudden and so fierce that Josie made a small, broken sound against his shoulder, and Callum, standing a respectful distance back, felt his own throat tighten with an ache that had less to do with this family's reunion than with the ghost of his own unresolved grief standing quietly beside him. Inside, over coffee gone lukewarm in chipped mugs, Walter told them, in halting sentences that seemed to cost him something to produce, that he had heard about the accident from a neighbor who'd read the local paper's brief mention of the wreck on Route 9, and that he had wanted to come to the hospital every single day since, and had not, because he did not know how to walk into a room and face the daughter he had failed so badly, could not bear the thought of her looking at him with the same wounded eyes she'd had the day he told her to sell the lake house and stop living in her mother's shadow. "I've been a coward," he said simply, looking down at his hands. "I told myself I was protecting you from a father who only knows how to disappoint people. But I think I was really just protecting myself from having to watch you decide I wasn't worth forgiving." Josie cried then, and so, quietly, did her father, and Callum sat between them saying nothing at all, understanding that his role in this particular scene was simply to have driven her there and to bear witness, the same role he had unknowingly auditioned for on the side of a highway weeks before. It was not a perfect reconciliation. Walter Hartley did not become, overnight, the father Josie had needed all those years. But he asked, haltingly, if he might visit her sometime, might see the classroom where she taught, might, if she'd let him, help fix the gutters on the lake house instead of selling it, because he'd realized, somewhere in the long nights of not visiting the hospital, that the house held her mother's memory the way his own stubborn silence had never managed to, and that maybe keeping it wasn't refusing to move on after all. Maybe it was simply choosing to remember with love instead of grief. If this story is stirring something in you, I want to pause here and ask you to leave a comment about the moment in your own life when someone showed up for you without being asked, or a time you finally found the courage to reach out to someone you'd let a silence grow too long with, because I think that's really what this whole story has been about, and I'd love to hear your version of it in the comments below. The months that followed were not without their own quiet difficulties. Josie's recovery required patience that tested her in ways the accident itself never had, the slow, humbling work of physical therapy, the frustration of a body that no longer did what her mind expected of it, the strange grief of realizing that some part of the woman she'd been before Route 9 was gone for good, replaced by someone slower to trust her own footing but somehow, in other ways, steadier than before. Callum was there for most of it, not because anyone expected him to be, but because he had discovered, somewhere in that hospital room during the long daylight hours of her recovery, that he wanted to be the kind of man who showed up, consistently, without needing a lie to justify his presence in someone's life. There were harder days too, days when old grief resurfaced without warning. Once, during a physical therapy session that left Josie in tears of frustration on the gym mat, unable to complete an exercise her body simply wasn't ready for, she snapped at Callum when he tried to help her up, told him she didn't need a hero, didn't need a man deciding what she could handle, that she'd spent her whole life with people either abandoning her or trying to manage her and she was exhausted by both. Callum, stung but steady, sat down on the mat beside her instead of standing over her, and said only, "I'm not trying to be your hero. I just don't want you to be alone while you figure out how to be strong again. There's a difference." It was a small moment, easily overlooked in the larger arc of the story, but it was in moments like this one that their relationship grew its real roots, not in the crisis of the accident, but in the unglamorous, daily work of two wounded people learning to be patient with each other's healing. Callum, for his part, found his own grief loosening its grip in ways he hadn't expected. He began, for the first time in 2 years, to speak Marisol's name out loud without his chest closing up around it. He told Josie, one afternoon in late November while they sat on the porch of the house he'd built, wrapped in blankets against the first real chill of the season, about the guilt he'd carried since the hiking accident, the conviction that if he had only insisted harder, driven out to that trailhead himself, none of it would have happened. Josie, who understood something about the peculiar mathematics of survivor's guilt, did not try to argue him out of the feeling. She only said, "You can't build a life out of all the ways you might have stopped something you had no power to stop. Believe me. I tried, with my mother, for years." It was, in its way, the exact medicine he had needed and had been too proud, or too afraid, to seek out from a grief counselor or a well-meaning friend. Coming from her, it landed differently, because she had earned the right to say it by having lived it herself. Dahlia, watching all of this unfold from her post behind the counter of her flower shop, took to teasing them both mercilessly about the accidental fiancé business, joking that Callum had simply skipped several years of dating and gone straight to the paperwork, and Josie, laughing in a way Callum had learned to treasure because it had been so rare and hard-won in those early hospital weeks, would swat her friend's arm and tell her to hush, though she never seemed entirely to mind the joke. Either. It became, over time, a kind of gentle family legend, the fair medic's mistake that nobody had bothered to correct, the accidental engagement that slowly, deliberately, became a real one. Winter came to Millbrook Falls, and with it came Josie's full return to her classroom, greeted by a chorus of small, delighted children who had made her a banner reading "Welcome back Miss Hartley" in wobbly, uneven letters that she kept pinned above her desk for the rest of the year. Walter Hartley, true to his halting promise, began visiting more regularly, fixing the gutters on the lake house as he'd said he would, and then the dock, and then, slowly, rebuilding something more essential than either, a relationship with his daughter built not on the avoidance of grief but on the shared, careful work of carrying it together. He and Callum discovered, to both their surprise, an easy companionship over the shared labor of home repair, Walter teaching Callum the particular knots his own father had taught him for securing a dock line, Callum teaching Walter, without either of them ever naming it directly, that it was possible to be gentle with the people you loved even after you'd failed them. By spring, the lake house that had once been a battleground between father and daughter had become, instead, a gathering place. Josie hung her watercolors on its walls, including 3 new paintings finished during her recovery, one of a highway shoulder at golden hour, though she never explained to anyone but Callum what it depicted, one of a hospital window with rain streaking the glass, and one, her favorite, of 2 hands clasped through a broken car window, painted from a memory she had pieced together slowly, in fragments, over the months of her recovery, a memory of the exact moment a stranger had decided not to let go. It was on the dock of that lake house, on a warm evening in early June, the light doing that long golden thing it does in the hour before an early summer sunset, that Callum finally asked Josie the question that made the old lie, at last, entirely and gladly true. He had thought about staging something elaborate, had gone so far as to ask Dahlia for advice on flowers, but in the end, standing on the weathered boards of a dock his own hands had helped repair, watching Josie skip a flat stone across the still water with the easy confidence of someone who had, over the past 8 months, remembered how to trust her own body again, he simply said her name, and when she turned, he was already on one knee, and he said, "Renata told me, on the worst day of your life, that I was your fiancé, and I never had the heart to correct her, because some part of me already knew I wanted it to be true. I'd like to make an honest woman out of a lie that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. Josephine Hartley, will you actually marry me?" Josie laughed and cried at the same time, the particular alchemy of joy and relief that only comes after a long, hard road, and said yes before he'd even finished getting the ring out of his pocket, and Walter Hartley, who had been watching from the porch under the flimsy pretense of grilling dinner, whooped loud enough to startle the birds off the lake, and Dahlia, who had somehow known to be there with a bottle of champagne already chilling in a cooler, burst into tears of her own. It was not the wedding of 2 strangers pretending to belong to each other in a hospital hallway. It was the wedding, 7 months later, of 2 people who had built something real out of an accident, a lie born of compassion, and the slow, deliberate choice to keep showing up for each other through every difficult, ordinary day in between. The wedding itself took place on that same dock the following autumn, under a canopy of maple trees just beginning to turn gold, because Josie had insisted it be daytime, insisted on morning light rather than candlelit evening, because she said she wanted to remember every detail with perfect clarity, having spent enough of the past year in the fog of concussion and grief to know exactly how precious clear sight could be. Renata Voss, the paramedic whose offhand words had started it all, was there among the guests, having become an unlikely friend to both of them over the months, invited by Josie herself with a card that read simply, "You were the first person to call him my fiancé. I thought you should be there when it finally came true." Renata cried through the entire ceremony and later admitted, with a laugh, that in 11 years of paramedic work she had made plenty of assumptions in the chaos of an emergency, but never once had one of them turned out quite this beautifully. Walter Hartley walked his daughter down a short aisle of scattered wildflowers, his hand steady on her arm, his eyes wet but his voice, when he leaned in to kiss her cheek before giving her away, entirely clear and sure. "Your mother would have loved him," he told her, quiet enough that only she could hear, "and she would have loved even more what you 2 built out of a hard thing." Years later, when their own daughter asked, as children eventually do, how her parents had met, Josie would tell her, with a soft laugh and Callum's hand warm in hers, about a fair-haired medic on the worst day of her life, a stranger who had held on when he had every reason to let go, and a lie that had never really been a lie at all, only the truth arriving a little early, dressed up as a mistake. She would tell her daughter that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is simply not correct the world when it hands them a chance to love someone, and that sometimes, if you are patient and honest and willing to do the hard, unglamorous work of actually becoming the person you were mistaken for, the mistake becomes the truest thing about you. And on quiet evenings, when the lake went still and gold with the last of the daylight, Callum would still sometimes reach for Josie's hand the way he had that first terrible afternoon on Route 9, not out of instinct born of crisis anymore, but out of the simple, settled habit of a man who had decided, once and for all, never again to let go of the people he loved.